In this section, we're going to talk about the disease cholera. Cholera is caused by a bacterium called Vibrio cholerae. It's a gram-negative bacterium, meaning it has two membranes, and it's kind of comma-shaped. The disease cholera has been known throughout recorded history, at least in India, but with the increase in worldwide travel, cholera began to cause pandemics instead of being localized to the Indian subcontinent. The bacteria that causes cholera was first identified in 1854. Cholera is a disease that is transmitted through most often the fecal-oral route. What this means is that people drink from water that has been contaminated with feces, and in that feces are the cholera bacteria, which gets ingested. Less commonly, but also possible, is to acquire the bacterium through the consumption of raw or undercooked shellfish, things like oysters or clams. Cholera is more common in warm months because the bacteria replicates better with the warmer temperatures, and we can kind of see this here. The incidence of cholera is shown in red. The sea surface temperature is in blue. As the sea surface temperature went up, the incidence of cholera went up. As the sea surface temperature went down, the incidence of cholera also went down. So again, cholera is mostly spread because people defecate and that feces gets into a water source, an untreated water source. The water is then consumed as drinking water, perhaps used to wash fruits and vegetables, or if people defecate and don't wash their hands and then prepare food or touch other things. So it's really important to prevent cholera that we have proper hygiene, so washing hands with soap and water, but even more importantly is adequate sanitation, water treatment facilities to remove sewage and to make sure that everybody has clean drinking water. In order to acquire cholera, a person usually has to ingest about 100 million bacteria. And the reason for this is that the bacteria are usually pretty sensitive to the stomach acid. So most of the bacteria are going to be killed when they get into the stomach. And that's why you have to ingest so many. The few stragglers that are left over are able to get into the intestines and establish infection. One of the really tricky things about cholera, though, is that children and individuals who are in poor health, and this could be poor health for a number of different reasons, but one of the most common is malnutrition, often have less stomach acid. Because they have less stomach acid, they would need to ingest fewer bacteria because those bacteria won't actually be killed in the stomach. In the intestines, the bacteria begin to produce a toxin, and the symptoms will begin anywhere from like 6 to 12 hours after ingestion of the bacteria. So that's enough time for them to get out of the stomach, get into the intestines, begin to reproduce, and start to produce that toxin. What happens with cholera is the toxin that the bacteria produces leads to massive water loss. Liters and liters of water loss per day. And so patients who have cholera actually die of dehydration. If a patient manages to survive 2 to 3 days of massive diarrhea, they are likely to survive the infection. The infection is usually what we call self-limiting. The just sheer volume of diarrhea that these patients has will eventually wash the bacteria away. So if they don't die of dehydration, they're generally going to survive. So the clinical features of cholera, it's all about poop today. Profuse, watery diarrhea. It's sometimes called rice water stool, and spoiler alert, I am going to show you a picture. And a patient will pass anywhere from 3 to 5 gallons per day. So just think about that. This is what the stool looks like, because at this point there is no solid material. It literally is just the water coming out of the body. These patients are going to be shedding millions and millions and millions and millions of bacteria in there. That is just full of bacteria. So what they'll do in an area that is having a cholera epidemic or cholera outbreak is set up these beds that are called cholera cots. So a cholera cot literally has a hole in it. There's a bucket underneath the hole. I'm sure you can imagine which part of the body goes over the hole and what gets collected in the bucket. The reason for this is twofold. One, you can get rid of the waste in a way that it can be sanitized so that it won't infect other people. But the other reason is that the only therapy that really works well for cholera is called rehydration therapy. And the idea is the doctors or the nurses need to know exactly how much fluid a patient has lost so that they can arrange for that patient to receive that much fluid back as rehydration therapy. This allows the patient to survive the dehydration, to survive the diarrhea, and hopefully recover from the infection. So as you might imagine, 3 to 5 gallons of diarrhea a day is going to lead to extreme dehydration. You can see this child here, how pinched the skin is. Other symptoms can include vomiting, lethargy, seizures, coma, and death in about 50% of untreated patients. And remember, children and people who are already in poor health are going to be more sensitive. So they are also going to be the ones who are going to be more likely to die. Throughout history, cholera was confined to India, but during the 1800s, because of increased trade, cholera was spread to the rest of the world. There have been 7 characterized pandemics since 1817. 1 million people died in Russia in the mid-1800s. The second pandemic began in 1827, and this was the first to reach the United States. And it's actually thought that one of our presidents, James Polk, died of cholera. The most recent pandemic, which is still kind of ongoing, began in the 1960s in Indonesia, caused by a very specific strain of cholera called the L-Tor strain. More recent outbreaks caused by this particular strain of cholera include an outbreak in Haiti, one in Ghana, and one in Yemen, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. So the first pandemic began in Calcutta. It spread to Thailand, Japan, and the Persian Gulf, and the African continent. The second began near the Ganges River and eventually made it to Canada and the United States in the 1830s. So again, we can see the first, and this is the 7th pandemic. It's just spreading throughout the world. So like I mentioned, treatment is rehydration therapy. So this is another cholera patient, and you can see that she's being given oral rehydration therapy. Loss of gallons of fluids causes extreme dehydration, but it can also lead to unbalanced levels of electrolytes and other ions. So this is not something that you would want to treat with water. You want to use some kind of solution that contains electrolytes and other compounds. So, you know, when we're sick here in the US, I know when I don't feel well, if I've been throwing up or something, one of the things I want is Gatorade, because it has those electrolytes to help you prevent dehydration. So this, of course, is not Gatorade. It's going to be more tailored medically to balance out all of the levels of electrolytes and ions, but it's not just water. Antibiotics are generally not going to work because, again, we're talking about a situation where the symptoms of the disease are really caused by the presence of the toxin. So yes, antibiotics can get rid of the bacteria, but the toxin is still there. And the patient is going to usually clear the infection within 2 to 3 days on their own without antibiotics anyway. Most antibiotics can take 7 to 10 days to effectively clear an infection. So there's no need to prescribe antibiotics to a patient who has acute cholera. So I've told you, why are antibiotics ineffective? There are some vaccines available against cholera, but the effectiveness decreases over time. So it's one of those that the patients would need to get booster shots over and over and over again. Not booster shots, it's an oral vaccine. So they'd have to retake the vaccine over and over and over again. And, the cost is actually relatively low for this. But one of the issues that we have to think about, because I imagine a lot of us think, well, if all you have to do is get a vaccine and it's really cheap, go get the vaccine. But we're talking about a disease that normally affects areas that already have really poor sanitation, where people are malnourished, they lack access to medical care. How in the world are you going to get them booster vaccines every time they need them? So these are people who live in medically neglected regions of the world. Much like all diseases, the symptoms of cholera were thought to originally be caused by what we call miasmas, or the bad air, right? You smell bad air, you're going to get sick. The quote-unquote father of epidemiology, John Snow, determined that in 1854, an outbreak of cholera in London was originating from a contaminated well. So people used to get their water from wells. All of the pumps for different wells are shown here with X's. Most of them are yellow. Here's an X that's red on Broad Street. And all these little dots represent people who died of cholera. And what he figured out was that this particular well had been dug 3 feet from basically somebody's sewer at the time, a cesspit where people put their waste. And what he did was he just removed the handle from the pump, so people had to go get their water somewhere else, and that ended the cholera outbreak in London. The bacterium itself was isolated in 1854. Nobody really cared all that much until a little bit after this. So a really famous microbiologist, Robert Koch, definitively identified the bacterium as the one that caused cholera. But there were some scientists who didn't believe him. So Koch said, I believe this bacterium that I've isolated causes cholera. This scientist here, Max van Pettenkofer, he did not believe Robert Koch, so he decided to drink a culture containing 1 billion bacteria. I do not recommend this. But he did it. And he got sick, as you might imagine. But his infection was mild, so he believed it wasn't cholera. He thought, well, I just got sick because I drank 1 billion bacteria, not because I got cholera. So then he made his assistant drink some. It was not a good occupation to be a scientist's assistant prior to the 1900s. The assistant also got sick. And then finally, the bacteriologist who supplied the cultures said, well, that he had actually given a weak strain. He didn't give a strong strain of cholera. He gave one that had been weakened. So people started to believe, okay, this bacteria is the one that is causing cholera. The outbreaks of cholera worldwide really helped to drive improved sanitation. Once people knew fecally contaminated water is how we're all getting cholera, improved sanitation helped to limit spread in countries that had the infrastructure to support that type of improved sanitation. During outbreaks, children are kept home from school, and government involvement in public health tends to improve outbreak outcomes. Really what you're talking about is the government of all these countries is responsible for the infrastructure for sanitation, for notifying people how diseases are transmitted. And so in countries where the government gets involved in these aspects and has the resources to deal with it, you tend to see less cholera. This is the story about two towns in Germany, Hamburg and Altona. So Hamburg did not improve their water supply. Altona did. They installed a water filtration plant. In 1892, cholera came to Hamburg and Altona, but only one side of the street got cholera, the other didn't. The one side of the street that was serviced by the city of Hamburg, which had not improved its water supply, got cholera. The city of Altona, which had improved their water supply, that side of the street had no cholera. After that, cities all over Europe improved their water supply, and cholera has never returned. However, while Europe and the US and other places like that seem to be safe from cholera, we have to remember that huge portions of the world do not have access to clean drinking water. So over 2 billion people can only access water that has been contaminated by feces. 2.4 billion people, nearly a third of the world's population, lives without basic sanitation facilities. So that's why cholera can be a huge, huge issue worldwide. This is one of the most recent maps I could find. Countries that reported cholera in red between 2010 and 2014. Countries that reported cholera with the dashes in 2015. And if they're red and orange dashed, it's both. So Australia only had cholera in 2015, but places like Mexico, China, India, they had cholera throughout the entire time. In February of 1991, 45,000 people in Peru had cholera. By March, that had jumped up to 175,000. And so the health ministry said it was not safe to eat raw fish. Remember, undercooked or raw, especially shellfish, can lead to cholera. What happens is the bacteria gets inside of these animals, and then when you don't cook them, the bacteria isn't killed. And then as you eat, it actually raises the pH of your stomach a little bit and can buffer and protect the bacteria to allow them to get into the intestines. So the president, of course, got on TV and he ate raw fish and he didn't get sick. He said it was safe. What he failed to mention was that his fish was caught out at sea, far away from the coastline and far away from sewage contamination. The Peruvian Minister of Fisheries did the same thing, ate raw fish on TV, said it was safe. His actually came from a little bit closer to the shoreline and he got cholera. In Haiti, I guess as close to the US as we could probably get with a really significant cholera outbreak, there was a major earthquake in January of 2010. Once aid workers from around the world came to Haiti to help them rebuild their infrastructure, they also brought cholera with them. And so until January of 2019, people were still being recorded as having cholera. There were nearly 800,000 cases of cholera in Haiti and 9,000 deaths. There is a current outbreak in Yemen. As of October of 2016, it's led to 2.5 million cases and 4,000 deaths. And what the issue here is in Yemen, that there's been a civil war, and that has led to destruction of their water and sanitation systems. So Yemen actually had infrastructure to prevent cholera, but because of the civil war, the unrest, and the destruction of their water and sanitation systems, cholera was able to take hold and has affected millions of people. We do periodically see cholera in the US. This is just a snapshot of cases from 2008. Most of them were associated with being residents or having traveled to other areas of the world. Some of them, though, were from consumption of seafood. So even though we don't see a lot of cholera cases in the U.S., I don't want you to think that we don't have cholera in the U.S. When I did my PhD, I actually worked next door to a lab that studied two bacterium, one of which was cholera. And they would go down, I did my PhD in Texas, they would go down to the Rio Grande, which is the border between the U.S. and Texas, and they would sample every year, and every year they isolated cholera. So it's not that the bacterium isn't here, it's just that we tend not to get too sick because we usually don't drink untreated water, and we most often don't eat undercooked, especially shellfish. But those of you who eat raw oysters, don't eat them from the Gulf Coast because Vibrio loves the Gulf Coast. Just don't do it. So our risk factors, again, poor sanitation is the biggest risk factor. Of course, contact with other patients, anyone who has reduced stomach acid. For some reason, people with type O blood seem to be more susceptible. I'm type O blood. I have not gotten cholera yet, so fingers crossed that I can avoid that for the rest of my life. And then, of course, the consumption of raw or undercooked shellfish.